All right. Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us this evening for the long-awaited launch of The Smallest Objective by Sharon Kirsch. This is one of New Star's first forays into the relatively new waters of virtual launch events, but we are very excited to be able to share this experiment with you all. First, I would like to acknowledge that here at New Star Books, we are broadcasting from and have the privilege of working on the unceded territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam First Nations peoples. In the nature of this virtual event, we would also like to extend that acknowledgement to the traditional custodians of the lands upon which you may be joining us this evening. Before we dive into the event, I would also like to just note a couple of things. This launch is being recorded. We will be posting a video in the coming days, so you'll be able to rewatch the launch and share that with friends and family who were unable to join us this evening. We also have a Q&A function on this Zoom event. You'll be able to post any of your questions there for a discussion at the end of the event. If you do not wish to have your name included in the final recording, you can submit your questions anonymously. And if you don't already have a copy of The Smallest Objective, we have partnered with Paragraph Bookstore as our virtual bookseller for the event. In lieu of a book table nestled in the corner of whichever cozy venue we would have hosted this event in under different circumstances, we invite you to visit their website, paragraphbooks.com, to pick up a copy. I now have the pleasure of introducing our host for this evening's launch. Jeanette Kelly is a long-standing figure in Canadian radio. Before recently retiring, she was the host of CBC's Sinker 6 and was the arts reporter for CBC TV and Daybreak. Jeanette has worked for CBC Radio in Quebec City, where she hosted Breakaway, the afternoon current affairs program, and Radio Active, a national program devoted to the music that Quebecers listen to. We are thrilled to have Jeanette hosting this event this evening, and I will throw the virtual microphone over to Jeanette now.
Hello. Thanks, Melissa, and good evening, bonsoir de Montréal. I would like to acknowledge that we are on unceded Indigenous lands. This is the traditional territory of both the Gahaga Mohawk and the Anishinaabe Algonquin peoples. And we're grateful for this opportunity to live here, and we thank the many generations who have taken care of this land and these waters. So bonsoir et bienvenue au lancement de The Smallest Objective de Sharon Kirsch. Sharon Kirsch is a travel writer, she's a blogger, and she's also written 2 books of nonfiction. Her first, What Species of Creatures, chronicles early settlers in the New World and the beasts that they encountered. And her new book we're celebrating tonight is The Smallest Objective. Now, this is a personal memoir. She writes about her mother's decline into dementia, her mother's move to an assisted care facility, and what Sharon finds as she cleans out the family home for sale. In The Smallest Objective, she digs, sometimes literally, and researches endlessly every small object that could shed light on her family's past. And in so doing, she illuminates the lives of several generations of Jewish Montrealers and the life of the city they came to, which is Montreal, where I am tonight. So I'm very pleased to welcome Sharon Kirsch. Thanks. Hello, Sharon.
Hello, Jeanette. Thank you so much. And I'm just going to do the land acknowledgement for Toronto before we get underway. So we acknowledge the land we are meeting on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. And I just want to say before we begin with some wonderful music, welcome to everybody participating from Canada, across the country, from the US, and I think we may have a few live streaming from Europe, possibly even from Kenya and Australia, depending on how early people have been able to get up. So we are the world tonight, and thank you very much.
Lovely, lovely. So as Sharon alluded, before we get into our conversation with her, we have a special guest for this launch, un musicien qui fait de la nouvelle musique juive, a klezmer rapper, a new Jewish music producer. His collaborators know no generational, social, cultural, or religious boundaries. Tonight he's here solo. Welcome, Socalled.
Klinken Glöcke, klinken Glocken, bim, bam, bom. Singt der Seide, singt der Socken, bim, bam, bom. Sinken Strahlen, fallen, fallen, flim und flamm. So gebobe, scheine Dobbe, Gott von Avram. A gute Woche, die Welt der ganze, a gute Woche. Tate noch auf Dole Wein, a bissl noch, euer Mama morgen wieder sorgen. In der Krumm singt der Seide, singt der Socken, aber him bom 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 bom, ja ba ba bim ba bom bom bom. Ma hoi hoi, ya ba ba bim ba bum bum bum, ba bum ba bum ba hoi, la da da bim ba bum, ya ba ba bim ba bum, ba ba bim ba bum, la da da la da da, la da da da, hey da 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 da. Bum 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 ya bum ya yam da 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 ya da 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 ya bum 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 ya Bubby bubby ma bum bum bum. Yabba bubba ma bum bum bum. Yabba bubba ma bum bum bum. Habba bum 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 ma bum bum bum. Yabba bubba ma bum bum bum. Yabba bubba ma bum bum bum. Baba Maya A gute Woche. A gute Woche.
Bravo. Thank you so much, Socalled.
Wonderful.
Lovely.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, Sharon, that sets a mood, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Couldn't be better.
We're in Jewish Montreal. We're talking about 3 generations of your family, 3 generations of Montrealers. The Smallest Objective investigates traces of past lives in objects hidden in the basement of your family home. Sharon, when did you decide to write about your mother's decline and what you were finding as you cleaned up her house for the sale?
Well, Jeanette, I'm not sure initially I thought I was writing about my mother's decline. The story really began with a request or a directive from my father. Before he died, he told me and my mother that he had buried a treasure underneath the bedroom carpet of the family home, and that if we were going to sell the house, we absolutely must retrieve this treasure. Now, that proved far more difficult than I had imagined. My father had instructed me to get a metal detector, and I did all the basics without any success, and eventually had to recruit some archaeologist friends and carpenter friends to assist me. And I'm not going to say what actually happened, but I will say that I found many treasures in the house of various kinds. And in terms of the types of things, I will just give a very quick list because we're going to talk about this more in depth later. But there were the ordinary sort of things people find in their parents' homes. And you yourself have been through this experience recently, I believe, the letters, the diaries, the old photo albums, the vintage clothing. I thought I'd just share one little thing here that I found, which is a passport from Expo 67, which many will remember, and with the visas, the so-called visas for all the different destinations. I know we're all feeling right now we'd like to be traveling beyond what we're able to do. As more specific to my family were some natural history and science objects. So there was my grandfather's microscope, which we'll be discussing, some lantern slides, and I can actually show what those look like. Those were slides, in his case, of plant cells, and they are illustrated here in the book. And I also found many specimens of rocks and sand, minerals, things that both my parents and my grandparents collected.
Why the title, The Smallest Objective?
The smallest objective refers to the smallest objective lens of a microscope belonging to my grandfather. So I will introduce him very briefly before the reading. Sharon Kirsch was born in Lithuania in Vilkomir in 1884 and immigrated to Canada, to Montreal in 1890. So that was before the really large mainstream immigration from Eastern Europe, but it had begun. He, against the odds, was very well educated and became a professor at McGill University and one of the first Jewish faculty members there, and he was a botanist, as those slides illustrate. So the smallest objective lens, returning to that, is the lens that creates the highest degree of magnification. It allows us to see things in the greatest detail, close up, and it became a sort of metaphor for the methodology I use in the book, which is a really close-up examination of lost family and forgotten objects.
So would you read something from the smallest objective, please?
Yes, thank you. And Melissa, I believe you are now going to put up a photograph of my grandfather, Simon, who owned the microscope. There we go. And so this will just be a fairly quick reading, everybody, of several minutes. So, my search for my grandfather had begun with a loss and an acquisition, my mother's removal to assisted living, and the retrieval of the microscope and lantern slides months before her house was to be opened up for sale. I didn't think to ask my mother about Simon's microscope and lantern slides, nor did I tell her I'd retrieved them. Whether I had a claim as their rightful owner, a mere custodian, or their legitimate heir, I couldn't have said, but it didn't take me long to discover the irony of my grandfather's unknowing gift, that these objects made of glass were not transparent. Though undeniably my grandfather's own flesh and blood, his namesake, I needed another, an outsider, to interpret his belongings. I had arranged to consult with Dr. Sutty, an antiquarian and retired academic, a guide with careful fingers, and a well-disciplined dog. And now we go into the meeting with Dr. Sutty. Come this way. Dr. Sutty pointed to a flight of stairs leading to his basement as the dog hovered above ground. We entered a room lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound books. More books and manuals were stacked on the floor, and not a corner of the central table was exposed, so dense was it with files and the accessories for old microscopes. Dr. Sutty shoved some folders aside. Now, let's see what you've got. Ah, it's a jug handle. He eased the microscope from its mahogany case. This is a good quality general science microscope, he continued, used in histology, among other fields. Histology, that was one of my grandfather's areas of interest. In preparing himself for the study of plants, Simon had enrolled in courses on anatomy and the microscopic dissection of tissues. Well, that makes sense then. Your grandfather's jug handle was produced by Bausch and Lomb. How old would this microscope be? If your instrument has a number, he pulled out a magnifying glass, we can look it up. I glanced over his shoulder as he read aloud, 148788. Dr. Sutty plucked a volume from one of his shelves, undeterred by the hundreds of others surrounding it. Ah, yes, the year of production would have been 1919, maybe 1920. The microscope dated from my grandfather's final years in academe, when already he must have been pondering a shift to real estate. Dr. Sutty smiled encouragingly. And now you ask me some questions, and I'll answer. I'm a believer in the Socratic method. Can we look at the parts and how they work? First came the oculars or eyepieces, in size and shape like rolls of old Kodak film, but with glass peepholes at the top. "See that," said Dr. Sutty, indicating that I should look through the eyepiece. "Your ocular has a pointer in it. That's an extra beyond the basic model." Next came the nose piece, the dull silver disc that held in place 3 objectives or lenses. These were suspended over a square of black metal, the stage, Dr. Sutty called it. "I'm going to fetch a light box," said Dr. Sutty, returning with a small black box resembling a miniature TV set. "If this doesn't work, I have another one. If not, you can see a grown man cry." For several minutes, he tinkered with purpose. As the box cast an even light over the microscope, we prepared to examine a micrometer slide, among the easiest of the period slides to see. Magnifying through the larger and middle objectives was relatively simple. Through the smallest of the 3, perversely the most high-powered, less so. Without droplets of balsam oil applied to the glass slide beneath it, the smallest objective would reveal nothing. Dr. Sutty reached for one of the translucent brown bottles, unscrewed the top, positioned the dropper over the slide, and squeezed. Once, twice, 3 times. Then he touched his nose to the sleek rim of the open bottle. "It smells like the forest after rain." And we'll leave Dr. Sutty there.
So that was the first reading from The Smallest Objective. Tell me, where did you discover that microscope?
I found the microscope in the basement in my parents' house on some shelves, and I don't believe I'd ever seen it before. I am actually going to show it to everybody briefly. I'm going to lift it up. It's very heavy, in fact. And so I hope everybody can see it well here. You see it's called a jug handle, very obviously because of the type of handle. And the objectives I've been referring to are these lenses here. Now, the smallest objective is not actually any smaller to look at than the others, but it is a lens of a different type. And so that is a microscope very happily celebrating its centenary as the book has come out. So that's a particularly nice little flourish.
So what else did you find in the basement, Sharon?
Well, I found things that belonged to family members who were really considered rather taboo. There was a leatherette suitcase belonging to my maternal grandmother, and in there were items from my great uncle Jockey, and we'll hear more about him later, but he was the shame of the family. A man who was a first-generation Canadian. His parents had come from Lithuania in the 1880s. Jockey himself was born in 1898 and became a very notorious figure of mid-century Montreal, somebody celebrated for his pranks, his relationship with celebrities, the hockey elite, and politicians. He was a raconteur and somebody who lived at the margins of the law. So from him, I found some photographs and some newspaper clippings, really not all that much. Then the other person represented in that suitcase was a taboo for a different reason. This was my Aunt Carol, a physiotherapist, a young woman of great promise who died tragically at a very young age in her mid-20s. And I have here one of the items that belonged to her. This is a cookbook I retrieved called A Treasure for My Daughter. And I hope everybody can see that all right without too much glare. This was a cookbook that my grandmother, her mother, gave a copy of to each of her daughters. It was published in 1950. not long after the Second World War, and the purpose was in part to safeguard Jewish tradition. So we can see here that my grandmother has actually inscribed this for my daughter Carol, and I believe it was given to her at her wedding. So this is one of the precious things I found. There were also postcards from Carol and recipe cards and all kinds of photographs, her Sweet 16 album, for instance. And then my mother's book, The Story of My Life, my mother's photo album as well.
Okay, so how did you take, there's a relatively small finding as a cookbook, a notebook, a passport for Expo 67. How did you take these relatively small findings and explore from there?
Well, I realized as I was going through this process that I was indeed in some ways my mother's daughter. My mother, as I relate, was quite fixated on small things, unfortunately, to a point where they became an obsession that was sometimes difficult for her. But I realized I had inherited that attention to detail from her, and also that capacity for observation from various members of my family. My grandfather, Simon, obviously, who was using his microscope, also my father, who was a physician, and my Aunt Carol, a physiotherapist. All of those are things that require close observation. But I did also need to go beyond the house to broader sources. I found a lot through the internet, particularly about Jockey Fleming, whose original name I'm not sure I've mentioned was Moses Rutenberg. And he was written about extensively in the media. I couldn't even exhaust everything about him. My grandfather, Simon, was somebody sometimes in the newspapers, but also somebody I was able to read about through archival materials, and I was able to get some interesting information from the Canadian Jewish Archives, from the Outremont Archives, and from the McGill Archives, where he had been a student. And one thing I found in the McGill Archives was in one of his old yearbooks, where he described himself as one of nature's living jokes as a young man.
Okay. Well, let's stay with your grandfather for a time, because he was a botanist. You talked about him being a professor at McGill, but he left that position under pretty sort of dire circumstances. Can you tell us what happened to him, and what did he go on to do then?
Sure. I think his situation at McGill was complicated. He started there doing a PhD under David Pierce Penhallow, who was a very distinguished American-born botanist, specialized in plants in the fossil record and plant physiology. He took Simon under his wing, and it was while Dr. Penhallow was alive that Simon gained his faculty position at the university. This was in about 1910. Dr. Penhallow then died tragically and very suddenly on a transatlantic crossing, and that probably made it more difficult for Simon. However, he did stay at the university for another 15 years or so, with a quick year away at the United States Forest Service. And I think by the early 1920s, Simon left the university in about 1925. There was a surge of anti-Semitism and general intolerance. The economy was changing. They were heading towards the Great Depression. And immigration to Canada, including Jewish immigration, had become much more severely limited. It was not unusual for people like university deans or presidents to make overtly anti-Semitic remarks about faculty and Jewish students. And certainly at the faculty level, Jews were extremely rare. So Simon also, though, had had quite a lively sideline in real estate for many years. And in 1925, he went into that full time. I think part of the incentive might also have been financial. It probably was more lucrative than the work he could do at the university, and his advancement there most likely was blocked because of his being Jewish. And he had 3 sons, 3 hungry boys, and a wife with a taste for finery that he had to support. I think we were going to talk also about his contribution to the health sector in Montreal. So this is obviously very topical right now. He was the person who chose the site of the Jewish General Hospital, which for those of you from outside of Montreal is one of Montreal's big medical institutions and a center at the moment for pandemic care. And he also was involved on the board of directors and the building committee for Mount Sinai Sanatorium. which, as its name would suggest, was for tuberculars. This was the second incarnation of the Sanatorium. It was built in 1930, and it was tremendously state-of-the-art and modern for the time, especially considering that this was during the Great Depression. It had an Art Deco facade. It had wonderful formal gardens, a rooftop cinema for the patients, and it was non-denominational, I'm glad to say, although many of the patients were Jewish garment workers from Montreal. People of all faiths were accepted, and that was true, I believe, for the Jewish General Hospital as well.
So all the while you're researching your grandfather, and you've mentioned Jockey Fleming as well, but you're also taking care of your mother, and
Yes.
your research is interspersed with these visits to your mother, and you document her state of health, and you're very frank about your relationship with your mother and her personality quirks. Were you thinking about what this tells us, her story tells us about what it was like to be a woman in the 1950s?
Certainly, and I think I became more aware of that as I went along. I did try to create a candid portrait of my mother, and I think, you know, our slight peculiarities or eccentricities are what make us interesting. So I wanted to illustrate as much of her as I could while feeling comfortable doing so. My mother was born during the Depression in 1932. She was a premature baby, an incubator baby, and she grew up into middle childhood during the Second World War. Her mother also had been quite ill and was in hospital for some months. So my mother's early childhood was not all that easy. Her sister Carol grew up in a slightly different period. She was 6 years younger than my mother, so born in 1938. And it was a period when she was growing up or coming to maturity in the late 1950s and early 60s, when opportunities for women were, I think, improving or becoming broader. My mother was very much a bride of the 1950s. And in Quebec, of course, as we know, that was also a time of great change. It was the lead up to Expo 67. It was a period of the Quiet Revolution, which for those outside of Quebec was a time of secularization and a great change with the relaxing of control by the Catholic Church in Quebec. And a time when Carol was able to travel suddenly by plane to various Caribbean islands, to become a career woman, a physiotherapist. She graduated at the top of her class, and I still have the book prize she won. That is one of the possessions I retrieved from her. And so, yes, there were two quite different stories there.
And how easy or difficult was it to write about your mother? You're kind of mourning your mother as you're exploring all of these other wonderful aspects of your family life.
I think it was both catharsis and difficult. I think I started off writing a lot of notes on the visits that I made to my mother. I was traveling repeatedly between Montreal and Toronto. I'm an only child. I guess I haven't said that yet for those who don't know. And so my mother's care fell largely to me. My father was no longer alive. And since my mother was suffering from memory loss, she really could not fend for herself. And I felt she was gradually vanishing from my life, which was a great sorrow. So when I wrote about her or wrote these notes, it was partly to remember the conversations I was having with her at that time. But it was also, in another way, a method of distancing myself somewhat from events, and yet at the same time finding meaning in them. And those notes really established, I think, without my realizing it at the time, the tone and voice for the book. And yes, so that's essentially how it happened.
So let's talk about Jockey Fleming.
Yes.
So are you going to do a bit of a reading about him, which would illustrate who he was? And would you like to introduce that?
Yes, sure. Jockey, as I said earlier, was a ticket tout, somebody who sold tickets for the hockey games and the Blue Bonnets racetrack at an inflated price. He was somebody who sold information in sealed envelopes, apparently. So he knew everybody in town and they knew him. And he was really, to some extent, the creation of journalists, although he also supplied them with a great deal of material. I think one of the interesting things about Jockey for me was that I was the first person to write about him, and I'm certainly in a very large company of people who did write about him, but I am the first, as far as I'm aware, who actually knew anything about his family background. It was rumored that he came from New Jersey, which was not at all true, and he was quite content to allow these stories to circulate about him without ever verifying their truth. Shall I do that reading now?
Please, thanks.
Okay, and Melissa, we're going to have the picture of Jockey, and then just so everybody knows, we will afterwards, a bit later in this reading, be seeing two other photographs, one of my parents at their marriage and another of Carol at her graduation from McGill with her mother. So I'll just find the appropriate page here, and here we go. My great uncle confounded some of the best newspapermen of the post-war era, the sports writers Jim Coleman and Dink Carroll, gossip columnists Fitz and Al Palmer, and humorist Don Bell. Whether by design or by accident, Jockey lived as a man without personal history. Left to describe his own lineage, he cited as distant and unknowing ancestors One-Eyed Connolly from Massachusetts and Pitsy Blackman from Cincinnati, both expert gatecrashers. In an homage to their example, Jockey reportedly gatecrashed Madison Square Garden by masquerading as a peanut vendor in a barber's white coat. My mother's uncle thus allowed to his chroniclers no more than spoofs, one-liners, carefully curated stories, and hearsay. Jockey's escapades, whether told by him or his fleet of newspapermen, often have him coming out on top. But there's another strain in the literature of Jockey, the occasional ridiculing of him by his own admirers, and as an element of his repartee, a belittling of himself. As early as 1921, my mother's uncle recited How I Became a Bum, his autobiography in brief, for a benefit at the Gaiety Theatre. Jockey soon after befriended Eddie Cantor, Mickey Rooney, and Al Jolson, all great guys, he said, and most are on top today, but the old jock is still at the corner of Peel and St. Catherine shoving his 2 hockey tickets. My grandfather, Jockey's brother, continually lamented that the family had no luck. I'm just going to jump ahead some pages here. Moses Rutenberg was born in the 1890s, Maurice my grandfather at the turn of the century. But Moses, not Maurice, became the innovator. It's he who deserves credit for self-determination. His inventiveness came from within, from his natural leanings, and from without, from the city he inhabited. In particular, Montreal in the war years allowed Moses Rutenberg to fulfill the promise of Jockey Fleming. As elsewhere, in Montreal, the anxiety of war fostered revelry. Already a source of illicit gambling and cheap whiskey in the 20s and 30s, Montreal in the mid-40s hosted some 200 gambling dens, plus nightclubs and blind pigs. At the Samovar, the El Morocco, and the TikTok Club, hustlers like Moses Rutenberg dodged Apache dancers and knife throwers. Nearby, in the Shea Wen Room, the newspaperman Dick Carroll, among the several literary endorsers of Jockey Fleming, drank in the lounge owned by the 2 prize fighters, Slitkins and Slotkins. Late nights ended at Ben's Delicatessen, garlic sausage only 10 cents, the breath of a nation. This was Freddie the Count's Montreal, Hickey the Lightman's, Oscar the Hammer's. Alongside Charlie the Horse, Jockey Fleming added to his already considerable reputation in a city open for business. And I'll just add here that Jockey was frequently called the jockey without a horse. While Jockey was floating Quebec's Napoleonic Code, Carol, one of his 2 dispossessed nieces, was poring over a birthday gift, the booklet Edvard Grieg, the story of the boy who made music in the land of the midnight sun. Carol, born 6 years after her sister, excelled at music, Latin poetry, history, and art. Renee, my mother, distinguished herself as a belle, her straight, thick hair as shiny black as obsidian, her first date, a Toronto boy called Milton Sky. When it came to family, Jockey rejected simile and couldn't have pictured himself to be like either of the girls. In fact, both nieces qualified as young equestrians and not merely in their imaginings. Melissa, I'm wondering if we could have the 2 photographs now, if that's possible. There we go, thank you. In the post-war years, Carol's mounts were Duchess, Pearl, and Tony, all dark horses. My mother at the same stables rode Golden K, brown with a white diamond on the forehead. The stables where the sisters rode were located less than an hour's drive from Montreal. There both girls became disciples of Mrs. Beresford, who taught them to ride cowboy style, legs parted. They were photographed extensively on horseback, but always motionless, never in a canter or a gallop, the photographer unwittingly casting a shadow. The hazy shape belonged to Maurice Rutenberg. The mounted girls belonged to him also, foretold in the only surviving photo of his mother, Esther Sosnitsky, her aloneness shared with a miniature jockey riding side saddle. For his part, Jockey Fleming remained engaged in the track. Foremost on his mind was the move at Bluebonnets to institute saliva testing of horses. What's going to happen to some of them old hopheads out at the track, he demanded of Jim Coleman, one of his more regular amanuenses. It looks as if they'll have to ship to Cuba or give themselves up at the Canada Packers plant. Simultaneously, but not in response, my mother had written her diary, went out with Greg T, riding Charlemagne. Not bad, eh? Greg T became a regular in my mother's diary as she approached 20. July 27th, Greg, horseback riding, movies. September 3rd, riding, hunt club, Greg. September 15th, Greg, Bill's bridal. My mother, Renee Rutenberg, was besotted. For 60 years, she kept in her diary a note he had written on the back of a rain check for a two-way car wash. I, Greg T, hereby guarantee that Renee Rutenberg not do any harm to the horse on Sunday morning. Indeed, on September 20th, she wrote, nearly died, followed by Greg, proposed marriage. And then on October 5th, broke off with Greg. The final entry, printed in cobalt blue pencil and half captured in a broken circle, turned out to be the last in my mother's 5-year diary. It signified as well a final break with riding and Mrs. Beresford. My mother, like the jockey without a horse, had been in the business of chronicling her personal history. Yet my mother had always relied on her own hand, jockey on dictation to scribes. Moreover, my mother's jottings had filled more than 100 pages, whereas jockey, nearly 3 times her age, found that his life story in print had been reduced to 600 words. And we'll leave it there. And I think Socalled is coming back for a minute.
Dance me to your beauty with a burning violin. Dance me through the panic, though I'm gathered safely in. Lift me like an olive branch and be my homeward dove. Dance me to the end of love. Dance me to the end of love.
Thanks, Josh and Sharon. Sharon,
Thank you. That was wonderful.
I'm wondering, are there pitfalls and challenges in undertaking a book like this, a memoir like this?
Well, I think there always are going to be questions about how much you reveal, what you find. It's not always necessarily comfortable. And you also have to ask yourself how much you want to share. You have the responsibility of representing people who are no longer able to speak for themselves. And that's quite a heavy burden. I had some friends read through my manuscript, people who had known my parents well, for instance, and asked them whether they felt it was a balanced portrayal. But I think there also is the great pleasure of bringing back people who are gone. And so, for instance, in the case of my Aunt Carol, who had such a short life and had so much promise, I hope in a small way I've been able to reinvigorate her memory. And as the same with my grandfather, Simon, it was very gratifying to see an article about him, a profile in the Westmount newspaper where he had lived. So there are many different aspects.
I know that I was going through my parents' house after my parents died, and with my sister, and we discovered so many things about my mother that I didn't know, particularly
Yes.
about my father as well. It made me feel there were so many questions I would have liked to ask them. Are there still things you would like to know about your family?
Oh, definitely. I would love to know more about the family background in Lithuania. Nobody has been able to tell very much about that. However, I did discover one thing that didn't make it into the book, and this is by way of an elderly relative recently. She told me that Abraham, who was Simon's father, and would have been my great-grandfather, was either a gunsmith or a goldsmith in Lithuania. And that was not something I knew. He worked as a peddler when he first came to Montreal, and eventually had a business, I believe, that was related to shipping, and became more successful, but obviously had left behind a different kind of profession there. I would love to know more about Jockey. Despite so much that has been written about him, we don't know, for instance, did he ever have a sustained romantic relationship? Was he ever in prison, which is a distinct possibility? And then I would love to know more about my Aunt Carol, and also even some of the tragic and sad aspects, like the impact on my parents' lives after her death and so on. I became aware of that somewhat later in my childhood, but she was not much talked about because it was such a painful topic.
Hmm. So that's interesting. It just brings up so many reflections and memories of, I'm sure, a lot of people who are listening as well. I think we have time now for questions from our audience. So I'll see if I can figure out how to find them and read them to you.
Okay.
So David Bernardi says, thank you. I enjoyed the music. Molly Peacock says, so glad to be here, Sharon. So Shelley Klein says, Sharon, please tell us a bit about your aunt, one of the moving parts of the memoir. Did you know her story beforehand?
Thank you, Shelley, for that question. And thank you, Molly and Dave, for your comments. I didn't know a great deal about Carol. My mother didn't really talk about her. It was a very awkward area of conversation. Whenever we passed Green Avenue in Montreal, which is a corner some of you will know, my mother will say that's where my sister collapsed. But it didn't go much beyond that. And I think also, even as a child, I sensed it was a very difficult topic, and I didn't pry. I didn't ask further questions, which I now regret. So I certainly didn't know very much about her. I discovered a lot through photographs, and I was able to speak to one of her friends who is still alive, and that was helpful. But there were many revelations, and including her extensive travels in the Caribbean, which I learned about through her postcards. And there was even a reference in one of them, I believe, to my conception, when she spoke of being very excited about some news my mother had just relayed to her. And that was kind of an odd and moving thing to find.
We have another question from Paolo Nohouse.
Yes.
Sharon, have any other relatives, cousins, or for instance, interested in your family history and contributing to that research?
I think I do. There are some people, some of whom I don't even especially know, but I've heard about, more distant cousins or relatives who have been doing some family trees, and I probably could find some of that now on Ancestry. But I have also had the pleasure through this book of making contact or resuming contact with some of my extended family, both in Montreal and elsewhere, including a cousin in Australia. I'm not sure if she's able to watch right now. And so we've all been exchanging photographs and stories. But as far as I'm aware, I am the only person to have written anything for publication about the family.
Robert and Jennifer Bell are asking, you write about your family members who are no longer alive. You've alluded to this in our question, but was it difficult to decide how much to reveal about them?
Yes, I think that is always a hard area. And of course, you know, you can take a very safe path and not reveal anything that could be at all controversial or unbecoming. But I don't think that would produce a very interesting book. I sometimes ask myself the question, what would my mother think or my parents think of this book that I have published and written about? And it's not really a question that I can easily answer, but I certainly wrote it, I hope, with empathy. and not with any sense of recrimination. And I hope that it is a balanced portrayal of everybody there, insofar as I was able to write one, because although it is labeled a memoir, it is as much about people I didn't know and had to find out about. And in that sense, there's not recollection.
I have another question here from Leslie Kirsch. Through all your research on your grandfather, Simon, what new discoveries about him surprised you the most?
Well, I did know that he was a distinguished academic. I'm not sure I was particularly aware of the health contribution to the city. I think my father had vaguely mentioned the Jewish General Hospital, but the Mount Sinai Sanatorium came as quite a surprise to me. I think my father had mentioned Simon had spent some time in Wisconsin, but it was all very vague. And I have to say, like many children, I wasn't especially interested in the family history. I think it was something I tended to tune out. And I do really regret not having asked more and listened harder.
Is the Art Deco building that was the Sanatorium still there? That's from Sandra Phillips.
No, sadly not. It was torn down not that many years ago. I couldn't give you the precise date, but possibly 15, 20 years ago. So it would not have been impossible for me to see it, but I was not aware of it until there was nothing there. And it is quite a sad sight, but surrounded by the Laurentian Mountains north of Montreal and quite a beautiful naturalized area now. There is a plaque to the nurses that remains there. And there is, I should say, a successor to that hospital in Montreal, the Mount Sinai Hospital, which some of you will know still survives in a new form in Montreal as somewhere where respiratory patients are treated, and also has a palliative care unit.
Maria Mendel asks another question. Did this research and discovery process give you any ideas for future projects? She says she wants to read more.
Oh, that's nice. Well, I did actually travel to Lithuania shortly after my mother died, and I wrote a whole chapter about my experience in Lithuania, which my publisher and I decided didn't actually belong in the book. So I have that material, and that is something I would certainly like to do more with. I would love to make another trip to Lithuania and perhaps be able to write something more expansive. I chose, when I went, not to use the services of a guide specialized in the Jewish history. I know some people thought that was foolish, but I felt I just wanted to experience the landscape and the whole environment without any mediation. But if I were lucky enough to go back for a second time, I would perhaps do it a different way and have some extra material from that experience.
I've got another question from some of the participants, but I was just thinking, oh my goodness, I've lost my track. What I was going to say. It's completely slipped my mind. So
well,
I'll go to Sandra Phillips' question. Will you reveal what was hidden under the carpet?
I don't think so. I think that's something you have to find out from the book itself. But let's just say it wasn't what I expected.
And let's just say there was an elaborate quest to figure out if there was something hidden under the carpet.
Yes.
Sharon, this was delightful to talk to you. And if I remember what I was going to say, I will butt in again. But thank you so much for writing The Smallest Objective and for taking part in this book launch tonight. I'll just close that Q&A. Was there another question? Yes. We have another question. Sorry. Congratulations, Sharon, on this book. This is from Steph Alexandru. Can you talk about how you strike a balance between mourning your mother and writing such a beautifully detailed memoir about her and your relatives? Was it tough to do both?
Well, I guess, yes, it was tough, but I guess the manuscript evolved over many years. I wrote it over 6 to 7 years. The only chapter I wrote when my mother was still alive was the very first chapter, Treasure. And as I said earlier, I wasn't at all sure that was part of anything larger. I just wrote an account of searching for that buried treasure and moving my mother to assisted living at that time. I think in a way, the farther I got away from the rawness of the experience over the years, the easier it became to craft the book. as an object separate from myself. And probably, you know, that distance helps at some point.
Yes. So I don't think there's any more questions. So shall we tell people how to get this book?
Can I do my thank yous, or am I supposed to do those
Of
after? Okay, I do want to say, is that all right if I do that now? I do want to thank a few people. I didn't do this right at the start because we had a lot of land acknowledgements and other thank yous. But of course, I want to thank New Star Books, Rolf, Vlad, and Melissa, all of you there. I want to thank my editor, Audrey McClellan, publicist Janice Kirshner, who's been doing a great job over these past months in very difficult pandemic circumstances, cover designer Robin Mitchell Cranfield for what I think is a very beautiful cover, and I know many have agreed. My web designer, Helen Dmitrievich, who I believe is watching tonight, and who also has received many accolades from people looking at the website. I must say thank you to my first reader, Sharon White in Philadelphia, who's watching and who has read the manuscript many times over, and Maria Meindl in Toronto for her very careful reading, Monica Sandor in Brussels, Jennifer Bell in Toronto for their input, my many archaeologist and carpenter friends for sharing in the journey. I apologize for not listing you all, but we're running out of time, but your contribution was invaluable. Dr. Sutty for his help with the microscope, all the archivists and museum staff. And finally, I want to thank my husband, Mark, who has been cutting my hair during the pandemic. and I thank him for all the other things he does for me. And to Jeanette and Socalled, thank you for making this such a wonderful evening.
Oh, well, this is great. And I love the haircut.
Thank you.
I think I'm going to go back and just, I've got other things from a chat.
Okay.
Paul Inua says, no, David Bernardi said, I think your parents would be proud. Victoria Dickinson, wonderful book and great stories, surprisingly reminiscent of my family, particularly the relationship between sisters. My mother and her aunt were 10 years apart and their lives were almost a generation apart. Do you have photos of Carol on the holiday?
Yes, well, I don't have photos of her. Yes, I do have photos of her in Mexico, and I can repost one or two of those to my blog so that Victoria and others can see them. There's a wonderful photo of Carol with a Mexican doctor, Rafael, who apparently wanted to marry her. She had met him when she was doing her physiotherapy training in Montreal, and then followed him back to Mexico, but I believe she was the one who decided she was not keen to live in Mexico. But yeah, there are some excellent photos from that period and in those wonderful early 1960s clothes as well.
And Teresa O'Malley says, Sharon, congratulations on this beautiful book. It's so different from your earlier book. After this experience, what do you want to write next?
I have actually started trying my hand at a little bit of short fiction, and we'll see where that goes. And I also have a word and image project. This is using photos of animal representations that I myself took. So they're not highly accomplished, but they're a starting point for some short prose pieces, and that incorporate cultural history and culinary history and all kinds of things. So we'll see where all that goes. But indeed, Teresa, it was a very different book from the first one.
I'm going back and forth between the Q&A and the chat. So on the chat, Sarah Solomon Schiff says, bravo, Sharon. I may have a piece of the Kirsch family tree, so please contact me if you're interested.
I will do. Thank you, Sarah in Edmonton.
I remembered my question. I was wondering, is your family story, do you think, typical of many of the stories of Jewish Montrealers?
Probably yes and no. I think that certainly the hardships of immigration would be typical. My family came over relatively early for that really large wave of Eastern European immigration. There were some Jews who came over much earlier, at the time the British, And I believe it's possible we have somebody from that family, the Hart family, listening this evening. But afterwards, the huge immigration of Eastern European Jews was really in the first decade of the 20th century, from about 1900 to 1910. My relatives came over somewhat earlier than that in the 1880s. So that aspect was not so typical. I think things actually got more difficult because as there was a huge influx of Jewish immigrants from the Pale of Settlement, the area of the Russian Empire to which Jews were confined, all of the facilities in Montreal and elsewhere became overwhelmed trying to accommodate these people. I think moving down to a more particular level, I think Jockey Fleming, for instance, was not especially typical. It was not unusual for Jews to be entertainers, but I think it was less usual, apparently, from my reading, for them to be criminals or near criminals. And so he was obviously a rather unusual personality. And then, of course, there are always the specifics of the family. My Aunt Carol's tragic death at such a young age is thankfully not something that would be characteristic of most people's experience either.
I guess just one last question from Paul in the house.
Sure.
What has been the first reaction to your book from Canadian critics and the Quebec and Ontario Jewish communities?
That's an interesting question. The critical articles I've received so far have been quite favorable. I don't know that I've actually heard a great deal from the Jewish communities specifically. Maybe that is still to come. You know, having a book come out during the height of the pandemic is a very odd experience. And when the book first emerged, we were in that first wave of the pandemic or just coming out of it. And nothing was really functioning as it ordinarily would. So we'll see. Some of the critical reaction has been somewhat delayed because of that.
One last question was,
yes.
Jackie, this is from Leslie Lutsky, I think her name is.
Okay.
Yes. Was Jockey Fleming invited to family affairs?
Not to my knowledge. I say in the book that certainly he did not appear to have been at my parents' wedding. He apparently was not at Carol's funeral because I still have the book. My parents kept everything, everything. So it took me a great deal of time to go through their house, but I was also grateful for everything they kept. And one of the things was this sad item, the book from Carol's funeral. I see no evidence of him there. So if he was there, he was hovering somewhere behind. It's not clear to me to what extent he was shunned by the family and to what extent that was also a choice of his own. I think there probably was a little bit of both, but I do believe that he and my grandfather kept in touch, and I'm not quite sure to what an extent, but I think there was contact there and I simply wasn't aware of it. I guess I should just share one thing, which I didn't mention earlier, but I did see Jockey once in my life when I was probably about 10 or 11 years old, and he was in front of Ogilvy's department store in Montreal, which is an iconic store. When my mother saw him, she grabbed me by the arm and pulled me across the street. And she said to me, he's not a bad man, but his family are ashamed of him. So that pretty well encapsulates how people responded to him in the family and probably beyond to some extent.
Well, it's a delightful read. Thanks so much, Sharon.
Thank you, Jeanette.
I quite enjoyed visiting with you tonight.
Yes, likewise. Thank you for being with me.
I think Josh Dolgin is going to stick around and play us out. So all the best to you, and I'll keep in touch for future.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for your help and making it such a nice evening for everybody. And Melissa, thank you for being such a great Zoom administrator.
No worries. I just wanted to jump on to thank you both for hosting us this evening and for your wonderful reading, Sharon. And many thanks also to Socalled for those fantastic musical interludes. Rolf, the publisher, is here as well.
Yes, masked.
And thank you to everyone who joined us tonight. This isn't our first choice for celebrating the launch of this book, but we are glad we could share it with you all. Just a reminder that you can purchase a copy of The Small Subjective at paragraphbooks.com. And you can find us at newstarbooks.com, and our lovely author can be found at sharonkirsch.com. And a last reminder that this launch is being recorded, and you can keep an eye out for the video of that in the coming days. Socalled is going to play us off, I believe, so stay safe and enjoy the rest of your evening.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Mazel tov, Sharon.
Thank you, Socalled, for your contribution.
Yeah.
Bravo.
Wonderful. Thank you.